Hi, I'm Sophie, and you're listening to Fifth Period.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Fifth Period, the film appreciation podcast where each week two media teachers take a student-selected film and scrutinize every little detail. My name is Mr. Brown, and with me as always is...
Mr. Whittle. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Term 2. Welcome back to the depths of the year. We are going into winter. Winter is coming, as some Game of Thrones fans might like to say this time of the year. But for me, it's an opportunity to watch more films. So I embrace the onset of winter because it's like, not that I already needed it because I just find my way anyway, but it's more justification to go, well, I've got to be indoors anyway. I might press play on something.
Well, it's funny you say that because over the holiday break, you were outshining me in terms of the amount of films that you were able to get through. But this week, I have actually watched, I think, 7 films. So, yeah, it's crazy. Now that we're back at school, I've watched more films than I watched over the holidays.
So that's a bit of a hint as to what's coming up in our weekly watches, but I will give the preview of the fact that I've watched more than 7.
There you go.
To the point where I've actually whittled it down to maybe I need to just give a highlights reel, because if I was to sit here and read through every single film that I've watched, I am on a big run with watching films at the moment. I am adoring film in a variety of ways. So yeah, I've actually decided to maybe give a bit of a highlights reel when we get to weekly watches, just because, yeah, it'll take too long to get through the 12 or 13 that I've watched since our last podcast.
Yes, yeah. I might need to do something similar. But if anyone does want to skip our main feature for the day and jump ahead to weekly watches or our other segment, Tantalising Trailers, I will leave time codes in the description below.
Very good.
In terms of the comment you made in regards to watching new films, the film that we are looking at today, I'd actually never seen before. So an excuse to watch it for this week was absolutely fantastic. So when Finn suggested it, I know he hadn't seen it either, so he was using it as a bit of an excuse to watch.
That's cool. I really like knowing that a student as well saw this as an opportunity. So maybe Finn did some digging around, because obviously the parameters we set are that it needs to be G or PG rated. So yeah, that's very cool that he found something that was a bit left of center, still met that requirement, and yeah, was something that he hadn't seen as well. I would have loved it if I hadn't seen it, but hopefully one day we'll get to a film that I haven't yet seen.
Fingers crossed.
We haven't done one yet this year that I haven't seen. Have we? I don't think so. No,
not from memory. No,
yeah.
The film I suggested for you, you'd seen previously before. So,
which film's that?
What Lies Beneath?
Yes. The Ford's epic.
I was on my best behavior. I didn't mention him, but you brought him up.
I've done it early on. It's going to continue on. So that's really cool that Finn recommended that.
In addition to thanking Finn for his suggestion, just a quick shout out to our guest student intro for the day, Sophie. It was actually quite funny. On Friday, I was talking to another student about potentially doing an intro, and Sophie overheard, and she says, I'll do it. I go to film club way more than she does. I should do it. And as the student walks away, she goes to me, what did I just agree to?
I've been a fan of Sophie for years now. She is just an absolute delight. So very pleased that she jumped on board for the intro.
Yes, and she is. She's always in film club each week. She's a very loyal supporter, even when she does have to leave mid-film to, in her words, make sure she gets her daily vitamin D. But like me, she actually hadn't seen this film either. So hopefully she caught up on it over the weekend. So she's ready to tune in for today.
That's a good segue into maybe encouraging generally our audience to make sure that, well, not make sure, but if you haven't seen it, or you maybe want to rewatch before Mr. Brown and I do the deep dive, you'd probably want to pause the podcast now and go and press play on it. It is on ClickView. I think it's on a few other streaming platforms as well.
I think I might have watched it on Disney Plus, perhaps.
Okay, cool. Yep.
It was definitely on some form of streaming, but I'm not sure where.
Yeah, so it is certainly around. It's a popular film, relatively new. 2012, this one got released.
Yeah.
So 11 years old now. Time flies, but it's still relatively modern compared to some of the others that we've watched.
Yeah.
It's not an 80s film for once.
That's true.
And nearly was this week as well. There was a suggestion put forward, but maybe
one of your favourite films.
Maybe we'll save that one for, maybe my birthday comes around in September, so maybe that's the time for that one. But yeah, do go and watch it. This one's not big on like story so much. I mean, obviously it has a story, but there's no big surprises.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I think there's some information that comes to light towards the end of the film that does change your interpretation of the film as a whole.
True.
It's not sort of like a big plot twist or anything, but it definitely does make you go back and look at the film in a whole new light.
Yeah, it reframes the entire narrative that you've just experienced, or adds to it, certainly. Consider this your warning, guys.
2012's Life of Pi, director Ang Lee. I'm pretty familiar with Ang Lee, but I just went back and I looked at a few of the different films that he has made. He's very diverse in the types of films that he makes.
Yeah, so he is a director that came over to America and tried to make his way in Hollywood. I think he got in with Pride and Prejudice in the early 90s. But yeah, there's obviously a few key titles that he's had success with.
Yeah, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Brokeback Mountain.
Yes, Academy Award-winning Brokeback Mountain. Huge film.
And some films that didn't go down so well, the Eric Bana version of The Hulk.
Now, obviously, everyone who listens to this podcast knows my ignorance towards most of these films that are based on superheroes and comics. But my understanding is that one is the worst of the lot when it comes to Hulk reps.
It's not even tied in with any other films. Can you imagine that? A superhero film that stands alone. You don't have to go watch 30 other films in order to appreciate it.
Gone are those days.
Even if you don't watch the 30 films, I'm not sure there's any way to appreciate that particular one.
Is it that bad?
Look, it's okay. And I think now you'd probably look back on it and it wouldn't have aged particularly well with how much focus there is on superheroes these days. But it's just a bit slow, a bit boring. Got a few of those in my weekly watches later on today.
Eric Bana was the first, and then Edward Norton, and then Mark Ruffalo. Yeah. Did Ruffalo get to do one as a standalone Hulk film?
Not as of yet.
No?
He's appeared in quite a few other people's films. So he's not the title character, but he was in the She-Hulk series. He was in one of the Thor films. So yeah, he's
done the rounds.
He has done the rounds, certainly.
So this movie is based on a 2001 novel of the same name. So it's an adaptation. What was interesting for me was reading the synopsis of the novel, because I haven't actually read the novel, was the novel went straight into telling the story of Pi. Whereas when we meet Pi, it's initially through an interview that he's doing with an author. So the way they've adapted the novel to the screen has been to insert the author as a character, which I found really interesting. Yeah,
and it makes it very, very clear in the narrative that the author is just an extension of this story. He's even listed just as the writer in his credit.
I guess we don't get his name. Yeah.
So he's not overly important in terms of his own personal character, but I think he's a really important character in the film because he allows this outside perspective in a narrative that's quite stylized and spectacular. He allows a voice of reason to be like, that does seem a little bit far-fetched.
There's that as well, and I think that's really important for this particular story. It did get me thinking, and it's something as a media teacher I've started really being more critical of, is when the ways that a filmmaker will choose to have exposition occur. Like, we talked about it with What Lies Beneath, where I thought it was a bit cheesy, where the photo album and the newspaper clippings, it did serve the purpose, and that film's not exclusively doing that. That's a very common way that these things occur. Happened in the Truman Show as well. So I think it's really interesting to see the varying devices that a filmmaker will use to get a story told. But I thought this one was quite interesting.
Yeah, and right from the beginning of the film, it makes it clear what the visual style of the film is going to be. Even as the credits are playing, we see beautiful imagery of the zoo. We see all the animals, really bright colors, not just the animals themselves, but the environments that they're in.
And the tone of the music as well. It's a very calming tone. I made the same note that the tone is set in that opening credit.
Yeah. And I mean, the imagery throughout the film is spectacular. It was probably my favorite part of the whole film.
Yeah.
Just the visual style and the fact that Ang Lee opted to go for a spectacle over a more realistic depiction of what each of these things would be.
Yeah, and like if you deep dive into the film, it does tie in thematically as well, but just in isolation, it does make it a very compelling film around, the colour that they use and the vibrance within the animals throughout the whole film, but certainly in the opening credits. Like you said, it sets the scene.
Because it starts with that mural that's quite bright and colourful, it makes a lot of sense for the rest of the film to then depict that same vibrance. Beautiful entry into the film for sure. And then obviously we are into Pi's house, and we meet the author or the writer, and we meet Pi as well. And Pi is obviously an elder man now, and the interview allows him to reflect on his life. That's why the writer's there. As the story goes on, we get less interjections from the writer. We get less narration.
For like 2/3 of the film, we don't get it. Which I did at a later point note that it feels like that device has almost been ignored or like forgotten. Like I would have thought it was just a spattering of it came in, but it was obviously a directorial decision.
For me, symbolically, it represents the fact that once a story does start to get into like the meatier aspects of it, you become so much more engrossed in it that you almost forget you're hearing a story and you just... you can visualize everything that's being told to you. But I thought it was a very clever way right at the beginning to progress a bit of his early life at a fast pace.
Agreed.
They have some great transitions back and forth between him telling the story and the actual sequences. He did a lot of keying out of the characters, and then they would be superimposed over the sequences.
This is a very unique, I assumedly, I couldn't think of another director that I've noted it where he does exactly that. The keying out, so the cutting out or the masking out of things, and then the overlaying was really a very specific style that Ang Lee brought to this film, and he uses it a lot in that throughout the film, but especially in that opening kind of act where we're learning about, and it's just it adds again to that tone of beauty in transitioning through those early years. I thought it was lovely. I loved it. And
look, I'm a huge fan of creative transitions in a film. I always feel like if you can transition in a more interesting way, why not?
Yeah.
I would much prefer a match cut to a regular cut when I'm watching a film. So that drew me in a lot, and it helped convey not just the beauty of the narrative, but just how fantastical the world is.
What can't be forgotten is that we're ostensibly being told this story from a narrator who is Pi telling his own story. Something we talk about in both media and English classes about the reliability of a narrator. So that comes to the fore more later on in the film as to how truthful what he's been telling us this whole time is. But because he's reflecting on his early years as a child, it's very important that there's a kind of a vagueness or a mystery to it, so that the reality is we don't always remember exactly what happened when we were kids. So I think the style of meshing things together and having it kind of flow contributes to that.
For sure.
Yeah. Like the one that stood out for me in particular is when he met Richard Parker.
Right.
So I don't know how far into the film I'm jumping here. That's probably a good point to jump to. Because I think the transition from present day Pi to talking about when he first met Richard Parker, the transition is it first brings up the bars of Richard Parker's cage, and then transitions to Pi and his brother looking inside to the cage. So that is just an example of what's the word? Masking? No, is it?
So like keying?
Keying. Yeah. It'd be keying out for sure. I thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, and one thing in particular too, I like that it's a messy storytelling. Have you ever been talking to a relative about a story, and as they're telling you details, they're remembering details and just inserting them in?
Kind of like what we do in the podcast.
For sure. Yeah. But it makes it feel so much more realistic, because that is how storytelling occurs. Yeah. You don't have a really neat way that you go through the narrative in a particular order. He talks about Richard Parker, and then he's like, oh, and now I'll mention this reasoning behind how Richard Parker got his name. And it's not neat, but it feels real.
Like a by the way, or, I've also remembered to tell you that.
Exactly right, yeah.
In fact, to the point where, like, right now, as I've talked about Richard Parker and said, I think that's a good jumping point, we've totally skipped over the bit where it talks about him getting his name.
His name. I love that sequence.
Yeah, I thought it was great too.
The moment where it pans around the classroom and all all the chalkboards and he's written the...
He's remembered all the pie.
Well,
yeah.
Yeah,
Not
I mean,
all
you
of
can't
it,
remember all of it.
Yeah.
But it's just so good.
Yeah.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
One thing that's really, really important when they're developing Pie's character is his interest in a variety of different religions.
Oh, so important to who he is as a character and what the story tells us, the audience, as well.
It also means that the film is a lot more accessible for people because it's not talking about one specific religion. It's talking about the thematic idea of faith in general.
Yes, but it's about challenging the dogma that people who are more traditional in their following of religion endeavor, where he as a child is going, well, why can't I have a little bit of... It reminded me of the old El Paso ad. Why can't we do both? Because he is like, I like this part of this religion, but I also like this part of this religion. So the innocence of a child going, why do we have to follow the rules like that?
Yeah.
I think that was really interesting as well.
It's a really good way of demonstrating to people who don't follow a particular religion why people engage with religion. I mean, you can for a variety of different reasons. You can be doing it based on faith. You could be doing it on a symbolic level, but you can be doing it based on just a need that religion provides.
Yes.
And for him to go in and immediately question things about a religion and say, yeah, it didn't make any sense, but I still really engaged with it and I got something out of it. Well, yeah, a lot of people don't necessarily say, oh, well, this must have happened, and the way that the faith represents this particular person, it went down exactly like that. They see it on a metaphorical level, and they like the fact that it's a community and that they can be involved in something. It doesn't necessarily mean everything actually happened as fact.
Which speaks to the story we're about to have unfold about him as well.
Exactly right.
You know, the life of Pi in terms of the story that unfolds in the film could be something that's taken from the Bible or the Quran or something like that, because it's got that fabulistic kind of, is that even a word? I'm going to make it one. Fabulistic structure to it. So it's certainly metaphorical for something else.
Yes,
Yeah.
And right when you think his faith is unwavering and cannot be challenged, he sees Richard Parker devour a goat.
Yes.
And everything is thrown into question.
And that is a reinforcement of what his father said at the dinner table, and presenting alongside these varying religions that Pi is exploring, the religion of reason, I think is the label he gives it. Why you should look to reason first before you look to religion. And the father is punishing Pi for his wayward actions. It also is, again, about reason. The tiger is not this magical figure. It's just a primal creature that is going to devour a goat. Yeah.
And I think it was really good early on, too, that they established that Pi was vegetarian as well, because it gives so many of the plot points that happen in the film.
He's not a meat pie?
Oh, no.
Oh, I'm very happy with that one. Oh, great.
But yes, it gives so much more weight to not just this scene in the film, but a variety of different scenes as we go through.
Yes, absolutely. I think what's kind of been established now is that this film is deeply philosophical.
Oh, for sure.
I think just through what we've talked about so far, it's something that is very evident throughout the whole film, but already by this point, thematically, it is really focused around philosophy and meaning of life. Yeah. I mean, it's in the title, life. And then the symbolism of choosing to have Pi as his name and represented there, Pi, for those of you who don't know it, is an equation that is used to determine, not radius, diameter, maybe. Mm-hmm. It's infinite in the amount of numbers it can relate to. So that concept of infinity as well comes into play, where the life is an endless kind of a way of approaching it. I like that in the symbolism of the title alone.
For sure. Post the goat sequence, he ages up. We get a bit of a time jump for Pi.
Yes.
And this is the part of the film where he meets, is it Anandi? Is that how you pronounce it? The girl he meets in the dancing class? Anandi.
Yeah, something along those lines.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think her role in this film is? What purpose does she serve in the narrative?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's a big one. I think he's obviously smitten by her when he first meets her dancing, and then he follows her, and then he asks the questions as to the meaning of some of her dance moves, and she clarifies that a particular move that he was unsure about was a lotus flower. Mm-hmm. And then he questions things about, well, how does a lotus flower also exist within the context of the entire dance? Maybe that's exemplifying his contemplation.
Well, and that's what I got out of it. His curiosity is
Yeah.
a major part of the film because it's what causes him to leave the cabin on the boat as well in the later scene. And so I think his curiosity is important. But the other thing I thought was we meet her and then he leaves her pretty quickly in the narrative after that. And he explains how he remembers everything that day that they did together on their final day except their goodbye. And I thought it was a really nice sort of foreshadowing of how when he looks at a story, he looks at the good in it or he removes any negative elements of that story from it.
Yeah, but then it's contrasting or conflicting with what his concerns were with Richard Parker towards the end of the film, which I hadn't even picked up on that. That's so, very deep, that kind of, when you are pondering things like that, you do need to go, well, I thought this about this in this circumstance, but maybe differently. And that's how we learn, right?
Yeah.
Very cool. That scene where the father intends to move them to Canada, that's the first time we see any imagery of the ocean or the sea.
Yeah, right.
So they're sitting underneath the pier.
yeah.
Beautiful shot, by the way. Like there's a particular
They
wide.
all are, right?
Yeah. But then, we see the sea. And I think the sea or the ocean, however you want to put it, becomes really symbolic of, again, that point of like the immensity of life and opportunity and the unknown and that whole kind of infinity value. Our protagonist is heading out into the unknown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then we get the ship scene. They introduce us to some of the characters on the ship. And at the time I was like, oh, what was the point of that? Obviously it comes into play significantly later in the film, but they introduce us to the cook and they also introduce us to, I can't remember this character's name, but he sort of offers them comfort by saying that he too doesn't eat the meat on the ship and that he just eats the rice with the gravy.
So besides the fact that they just wanted to get one Gérard Depardieu into the film, every time I see that guy, you can't say his name without putting on the accent, I don't think.
Gérard Depardieu.
Gérard Depardieu. He played the cook. But yeah, I made the note that it's Pye's journey going on the cargo ship and off to Canada is a big unknown. The culture shock that he experiences from leaving his home and experiencing these different cultures, so the cook's thoughts on vegetarianism versus the fact that other character, he embraces vegetarianism and has found a way to kind of work with it. I think it's part of the coming of age element of the film.
He's no longer safe in his sanctuary.
Yeah.
Which it's cool. It's really good because it again is this stepping stone to the dangers that are about to unfold.
He is going into the danger zone.
Yeah, he is.
Referencing back to another podcast.
Our favourite podcast.
Yes.
All right, so the shipwreck itself is crazy.
The whole scene.
The sequence is fantastic.
So it starts out with the storms come and Pye gets curious and he goes out on top deck. Now, the way he responds to the storm, this is this massive storm, I'd be crapping my pants if I was on that deck. Already you could see that the ship's gonna be challenged going through this stormy sea. But he is calling to the gods, absolutely loving it, big smile on his face. But before he goes out onto the deck, his brother, I think it's his brother that he's napping with, says, "Don't tempt the storm, Pye."
Yeah.
And that's exactly what he does, right? Yeah.
I mean, the scene that would be scary to anyone else, but it is spectacular to him, takes a quick turn when he sees the first person go overboard.
Yes.
And it's really dark. It's quite a shock to, I mean, obviously you'd seen the film before. I hadn't. I expected that there would be some sort of a shipwreck just from the advertising of the film, but I didn't quite know the carnage that it would cause. I didn't expect that the ship itself would be completely sunken. I thought perhaps maybe he would be washed overboard or something like that, but yeah, I didn't expect that everyone aboard essentially would die.
Absolutely, there's a little bit of inferred graphic nature to it. It's a more modern film, but that whole scene made me think of another film, The Wizard of Oz. A natural disaster comes and turns their world upside down.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, so when that occurred, I'd obviously seen the film before, but this time around I'm like, oh, there's a bit of a nod to Wizard of Oz for me. The story goes in different paths thereafter, but it's still enters into a world where we don't know how real things are.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought of that when it came up to that scene.
But yes, the zebra takes a big leap from the boat. Yeah, I know. I felt really bad for all of the animals in this film.
Yeah.
Which of course you're supposed to. You're supposed to emote with them in the same way that Pi does. But it causes the lifeboat to crash, and then we get this shot where Richard Parker jumps onto the boat, and as a result of that, Pi jumps off, fearing for his own safety. And we get this underwater shot of him seeing the entire ship submerged.
Yep.
It's so sad.
It's very, very sad. I for a film that's just PG, it does really, like, bluntly put forward the fact that Pi, and therefore the audience, is having to deal with a lot of death. Both of the animals, but also of his family and everyone that's died on the ship. It's very confrontational. To kind of consider that amount of death that's occurring, and I think the film does it very well. But he doesn't shy away from it.
No, not at all. We get the sequence next where Pi comes back onto the boat, and the hyena joins his crew. So we've got the orangutan, the zebra, and the hyena all on the boat.
Yes, I think it was around this time where Pi, as he looks to the ship going down, he's saying, "I'm sorry, mother. I'm sorry, father." He's apologizing. And it took me a while to go, why would he be apologizing? But I think it's because in his mind, he did tempt the gods to, like, he taunted them with dancing around when the storm was coming. So in his mind, he had a sense of guilt for what had occurred. Which bigger load of trauma for someone to deal with, right?
For sure. So yes, first up we get the orangutan who finds its way to the boat, and Pi is almost happy to see a friend.
Yes.
I was happy to see the orangutan too. I was like, oh, this is cool, like a nice character. He needs some sort of levity in this situation. But then the hyena comes onto the boat as well. We instantly see the tension of this zebra that's still alive, but just barely, and this orangutan that's there, and now a predator that is in the midst with these two creatures.
Yeah, and giving a bit of a nod back to when his father put the goat to Richard Parker in the earlier scene, we are faced with the brutality of the circle of life, and how, like, no matter how magical you think an orangutan is, they're still seen as something that a hyena is going to attack, and that's something about a hyena. My understanding is that they don't commonly attack for meat; they just attack to kill. Which is just an inherent trait. I think they attack for meat as well, but it's again confronting.
The Lion King is the extent of my knowledge on hyenas. So my understanding is they all sound like Whoopi Goldberg.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. In
this sequence too, though, before he actually attacks and kills these animals, the orangutan attacks first.
And Pi cheers him on as well. Yeah.
And you get so much of an insight into how Pi is feeling in this situation. Like, when he sees that the zebra's being attacked, despite the fact that the zebra's almost dead anyway, when it's being eaten, he still feels really upset for that animal. And as I said before, so did I. Anytime that the animals were in torment, I feel like I really mirrored how Pi was feeling about
Absolutely. And that's like talking about how humans commonly do that, where we apply our morals and our values to animals. Like we do it with our dogs all the time, right? It's like, oh, they're thinking this. It's like, no, they're not. They're a dog, all right? Like, we want them to think that, and that's how we would think if we were them, but they're a dog, not a human. And his dad reminds him of that in that previous conversation as well. But he, throughout the film, he doesn't change from this. He says something about, I saw the soul in his eyes when he first meets Richard Parker.
Yeah.
And he has a deep connection with all life.
Yeah.
So Life of Pi isn't about just his life. It's also about the life he sees in everything. So, when he sees a threat to any form of life, when he catches the fish, I'm jumping ahead, like, he looks into the fish's eyes and says and apologizes for what he has to do. So the idea is that all life is beautiful to him, all life is sacred, and that justifies why he's a veggie as well.
Well, yeah, and I think the film purposely injects more animals into it than would be realistic. Yes. Think of the amount of sea life he sees, like sharks, dolphins, whales, jellyfish. It probably wouldn't be that much, but because it's representing that idea, you go, yep, fine, that's there.
Which, like, I'm being very superficial and naive on this, but my understanding in a general sense is much of maybe Hindu religion is based, like, in their the sacred nature of animal life and why many of them are vegetarian is because of a similar holding of animal life where they find all animals to be sacred.
Yeah. Speaking of animals, surprise, Richard Parker's on the boat.
Yes, he is.
If you've seen any sort of advertising for the film, you were probably expecting him to turn up at some point. He's always in the poster on the boat with him. Plus, we saw him on the boat earlier. We just assumed that perhaps he's fallen off.
Yeah, I mean, because I'd seen the film, I knew he pops up again. But I do like that they hold off for a while and let Pi deal with some other issues before they go, oh, by the way, Tiger on board.
Yeah. It was a cool reveal, and I like that once he's introduced, it takes a long time for Pi to be able to feel comfortable being on the boat with him.
Yes.
Despite the amount of spectacular things that occur in this film, that's something that they do really, really well. They have this whole survival guide thing where he is training the tiger, in inverted commas, to bend to his will, and then as soon as he goes through it, the last step on the training is forget everything you just learned. Yeah. Because it doesn't work.
Yes.
It's so clever.
That book that he finds that sets him off on the training as well, that is a nod to his father's, the rationale, like that, sorry, the reasoning, like trying to look at things in a logical manner. Because I think what sets him off is like, all right, if we're going to live together, we're going to have to learn to communicate together.
Yeah.
So there's a quote like that. And then he's reading the book on how to do things. So it's very much a matter of respect of knowledge and of the Enlightenment era, post-Enlightenment kind of scientific approach to things. But in the later storm that comes, that book goes out of his hand. He loses the book, which I think is a reference, is symbolic of the fact that he's now going to have to look more to his spirituality.
That's interesting you mentioned the book. I always thought, the one time I watched this, I thought it was the book that he was writing his own sort of journal entries in.
Oh, it was too, yes. Like, yeah. And yeah, if I'd looked at my notes, I would have remembered that. So, yeah, the book that he does lose is his journal. And he's very upset to lose that. And, I mean, I'm jumping ahead now. But, like, for me, his despair at losing it is because he has been writing in this journal to at least capture the truth. All right? Even though we find out later that truth is different again. Yeah, so he feels like the documentation is where the truth will lie, and therefore losing it means he's losing the truth.
Yeah.
So I did have insight on that one as well, but I crossed it over. Yeah.
At this point, Richard Parker falls in the water or jumps in the water chasing some fish.
Yes.
And then can't get back in the boat.
Yes.
And I loved this sequence.
Well, it's kind of... Because it's not until night that he eventually gets back on the boat, right?
It provides Pi with an opportunity to stock up on his resources and build a better version of his raft.
That's right, yes.
And then he helps Richard Parker get back onto the boat so that he can jump back.
Yeah, so by the time he gets back on the boat, it's kind of dusk. And yeah, so poor Richard Parker is drenched because he's been in that water for assumedly hours, just like kind of paddling around the boat. But yeah, I
felt sorry for him.
I did as well, but you kind of could see that a relationship was going to form between the two. Like, I mean, it already had, but like to the point where they were going to work out a compromise where both could live as required in the circumstance.
Yeah. As I said, a lot of animals do feature in different sequences. I think it's shortly after this that we get the giant whale, like the blue whale or something, coming out of the water and flipping him off his raft. The raft that he's just meticulously put together. He spent hours and struggling trying to make it all perfect, and then it gets flipped. And I found myself just going, "Oh, come on, give him a break."
Yeah, for sure. But like in terms of imagery within that scene, it's probably the most magical looking scene because prior to the whale coming out, it's got all the glowing jellyfish well around it. I love that scene. A bit later on, there's a scene where Richard Parker's looking into the water. and then
Oh, yeah.
am I close to?
I think that's like the flying fish scene, yeah?
Yes, yeah. Which let's talk about the flying fish scene.
Yeah.
Because for me, was this the first time you noticed that it changes the aspect ratio?
It was the first time I noticed,
Yeah.
and then I looked it up. Apparently, it happens quite a bit throughout the film. But
I saw it happen later, and then once it happened, and I'm like, oh, obviously this is deliberate. I'm going to keep an eye out for it. Not like actively, but like, be a bit more concentrating. And it does happen one or two more times later on, but I hadn't noticed it prior to this.
Nor had I.
Yeah. Did it also take you out of the film a little bit?
It did,
yeah. For me.
Which I think is the opposite effect that it was trying to achieve.
Yeah. So it is a critique for me that even though there was obviously an intent for it, it did take me out of the film.
I don't dislike the idea. I think it's a really cool idea, but it perhaps could have been done better with a transition, almost like it brought in the different aspect ratio rather than just a cut.
Even one time during the flying fish because then we see a bunch of different fish kind of jumping about and going crazy. There's one part where the fish jumps into the aspect rate, like into the letterboxing. So it overlaps into the black bar at the bottom.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, clearly that like Ang Lee's gone gangbusters in post. I agree. If it had been done in a more subtle manner, or like it was just very abrupt and it took me away from just being immersed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like often in like martial arts films when characters are about to fight, the aspect ratio will change, but you actually see the black bars like creep in.
Yeah, I love that.
I feel like something like that could have worked because I think they're trying to go for a similar sort of thing. They're suggesting to the audience, oh, you're going to want to see this in widescreen. But cool scene, very cool scene.
That prior to that, there's a quote, I think it's actually leading into that scene where Pi, in his narration, says, "Hunger can change everything you know about yourself." That is him learning along the way, and the audience gets to understand that he's knowing that he is going to have to capture fish and make sure that he and Richard Parker have food. So he's kind of justifying. Pi doesn't actually eat any fish, but he knows he needs to catch it. He knows Richard Parker needs meat.
I think he does eat the big fish, the one that he steals off Richard Parker.
Yep.
He eats it, and then he uses that same fish to train Richard Parker.
Yes, yep.
It's around this point, too, that we see a ship in the distance, like a cargo ship, and he tries to signal to it, but is unsuccessful. And it's through this that his spirit is broken.
Yes.
Which it was at this point in the film where I started to feel a little broken watching it too, because I was like, oh, he's been through so much, which I guess is a testament to how Ang Lee has created the film, that you can go on this journey with Pi and all the emotional beats that he's hitting, you as an audience member really respond to as well.
Absolutely. And also, like, his connection to Richard Parker is really something that, even if you aren't as much of an animal lover as, say, Pi is or me or whoever, like, you can still kind of respect at a general level where he's coming from as a character in terms of that connection to nature. So the whale, for instance, going back to that whale, the whale comes out of the ground and he's looking up and, like, looking at the majesty of it all. But then the whale is destructive as well. So there's a duality to it that kind of comes into play where, like, the good and the bad are presented within the one thing occurring.
Which is what made him respond to the storm in the first place. And also, when there's a storm at this point as well, he still thinks it's this magical thing.
Yeah. Yep.
He pulls all the covering off the top of the boat. He insists that Richard Parker embraces the storm. And then when he sees Richard Parker's reaction to it, and it doesn't quite meet that same excitement from him, it's almost like everything kind of comes into alignment and he realizes this isn't a good thing. I've been looking at the world through a magical lens.
Yeah.
And he just kind of sinks into the reality of it.
Yeah.
And this is when we get all these really sullen shots of them lying on the boat, not moving. And it really emphasizes that broken spirit.
There's one shot, I don't know, I think it might just be before that, but where Richard Parker's looking out into the water and Pi says, "What are you looking at?" And then it dives into the water and it takes you on this sequence of, like, magical stuff, this meshing of the animals coming out of the whale corpse, and then it finally sees the sunken boat. And it's not meant to be literal. It's not like Richard Parker or Pi are experiencing this. It's Pi's thoughts on what Richard Parker could be seeing in the water. We find out later is that Richard Parker was Pi. We told you about the spoiler alert, guys. They cut back, and it's not Richard Parker looking back in the water, it's Pi looking in the water. So the same perspective that Richard's had, Pi's had, but that actual sequence where I loved that as well in terms of the imagery. And like, Ang Lee was more than happy to use a bunch of CGI, and it's pretty good stuff in 12.
I mean, it is great stuff, but also it doesn't need to look realistic because of the message that it's conveying.
Yeah, so that's sometimes when you have a certain story you're going to tell and you are going to rely on that kind of thing, it's okay if it's not perfect. Same with RRR, I think.
For sure.
But that particular sequence, I just adored it. I thought that underwater kind of element and these animals kind of meshing, and like it's about life and like how everything's connected, and yeah, it was beautiful.
And just when all hope is lost, they see the island, or they hit the island. I really liked this scene. I think it came in at the right time. We were seeing a lot of repetition in the narrative. Things were getting progressively worse. We needed an element of hope to inject new life into the film.
Agreed.
Yeah, I love this sequence. All the meerkats on the island.
The meerkats were so much fun. But what I also love about this sequence is the reinforcement of, because you know how he goes to the pool during the day, and he's able to get fish from it for Richard and all this stuff. Is that what he does in the pool? There's something about that gives him life from the pool. I can't remember what
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's just him kind of splashing water or drinking from it, perhaps. Because I remember specifically Richard feasts on the meerkats.
Yeah.
And you get this shot of Pi being like, oh, Richard, shaking his head. I was like, well, you've come very far.
Just allow you. Like, it's one of a million, so it doesn't matter, right? But then we learn, this is when it kind of cuts back to the present day Pi and the writer. Because they show the tooth. Yeah. And then the present day Pi talks about how he learns later on that the pools became some kind of mysteriously acidic kind of thing for humans.
Yeah, so the island he describes as a carnivorous island.
Yeah.
Which there may actually be elements of truth to that, but in this film in particular, it works as a metaphor for living out the rest of your days in isolation.
Yes, and it then comes back and reinforces that idea of duality where the actual quote, something about the give and take of life, where the island gave him life with the water during the day, but then it takes life at night. And that idea of light and dark as well when it's doing it, really so much symbolism throughout this whole film. It's immense.
The pacing of the film works on a symbolic level as well, because it's not long after the time he spends on the island when he takes off again that he finds shore. And it's less like, oh, he had to be out there for a long period of time. It's more like he had to learn all his life lessons before he would make it back to shore. Yeah, I thought that was really, really cool.
Then he obviously leaves that island, finds solace in with Richard Parker, and Richard Parker just walks off.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
Yeah, and like it's more heartbreaking the way that present-day Pi tells the story as well. But that in itself is a lesson for Pi about the act of letting go. Like he said, it wasn't so much that he had to let him go; it was the fact that he never got to say goodbye. It was so unceremonious, which ties back in with his love from before he heads off.
His family,
yeah, all of it, right? You know, like so. For me, the message there was really about taking stock in the present day so that, you know, when you have the opportunities to tell people that you love them, take those opportunities. And, like, it was one of a multitude of messages throughout the film. Yeah.
For sure. After he tells the bulk of the narrative, he says to the writer, hard to believe, right? And the writer says, yeah, it's a lot to take in, because we have also just witnessed this story and we go, well, it was a great story, but yeah, it's a bit unrealistic that all of this stuff would have happened. And so I like that they have this character separate from the narrative that does that commentary.
Yeah, like the contemplation, the philosophical contemplation of it. Another thing that they say between each other that I really liked, the writer says to him, so what do you think it all means? And he goes, it happened, why should it mean anything? And I'm so dismissive of this epic story he's told. It's happened, why should it mean anything? It's like, well, he's right. It doesn't have to mean something, but if you want it to, it can. And that's the message there of that.
It is at this point in the film that we do get the big revelation. He's talking about the fact that people who, it's almost kind of like insurance people who were trying to investigate what's happened with the boat, don't believe the story that he tells. And so he tries to tell a more convincing story, a more believable story that he substitutes in. He doesn't refer to it as the truth. He refers to it as the story he had to tell them so that they would believe it.
Now, structurally, the way they tell this different story in the script, it doesn't come clear, at least it didn't to me, that it is all just re-representation of the other characters we've just spent a story with. Not until the writer points it out. I wasn't wholly aware that Richard Parker was himself, and then the orangutan was his mother. Yeah, you know, and then the cook was there as well, who was the
hyena.
Yeah. So I maybe I'm just a bit ignorant to that stuff, but like until the writer's revelation of stating it, I was like, oh. So I enjoyed that. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, certainly at first I didn't realize it when he's just talking about the shipwreck.
Yeah.
As they start to describe what's going on with the family, I made the comparison to the animals, but it's haunting. It's really haunting. And we haven't lived through, but we've seen the narrative play out with the animals, and we know how heartbreaking it was to witness that. And so when you can make that comparison with the real story, it brings up all those emotions again, but to a much larger degree, because this is his family that he's witnessing.
Depth. Yeah, for sure.
There is such a great line at the end where he says, it doesn't matter which story is true.
Yeah.
He says, which one did you prefer?
Yeah, that's right. And then like for me, that encapsulates any cynic that looks at religion and goes, at the end of it all, we die anyway. Which story do you want to believe? I think it's something like that. Yeah, I get it more now. Like, you know, like that religion can be something where we are telling the story in a way that it's all about how you make sense of the world, right? So yeah, it was a bigger question being asked through that analogy. I loved it so much.
Yeah. So overall, I thought the film was fantastic.
I'm so relieved to hear that, because I had like Mr. Brown, better than any other week, you have kept your opinions to yourself on this one. Like, I don't know whether it's just because we haven't spoken since we watched it respectively on the weekend, but yeah, I had no idea what to expect in terms of what your thoughts were on the film. And then Javier yesterday came and spoke to me at lunch, and I said, Mr. Brown hasn't told me his thoughts. And he says, I know what his thoughts are, but I'll keep it quiet. So even our audience is like up for keeping the conversation for the podcast. I like it.
Yeah, well, I was talking to Jay in class yesterday and rattling off a bunch of things. And then I said, you better still listen to this week's episode of the podcast. I'm giving you all my key bits of information.
Content reveal.
Yes.
So you enjoyed it. Great.
I really did.
Yep.
It was great. And as I said, like, I really like this as an opportunity to watch films that I haven't seen before, but also like it as an opportunity to watch films that are a little more diverse from the films that I would necessarily be drawn to.
Yeah.
I mean, I watch all sorts of films, but I have my favorite genres and things, and I certainly wouldn't categorize this as one of my favorite genres. So I'm always really pleasantly surprised when I step out of that comfort zone and really respond to a different type of narrative.
Yeah, well, I'm obviously a big fan of it as well. I think I enjoyed it more this time around. I would have seen it at the time when it came out, and probably was, 2012. I was in my late 20s. And I loved it then. I've kept it since in terms of my library. But yeah, going back to it now with just a bit of a wiser brain in my skull, I was a big fan of it. Yep.
Yeah, good. Shall we move on to weekly watches?
We better. So I will kick off. As mentioned at the top of the podcast, I have been going even harder on films than I probably did over the term break.
I was sure I had you beat this week.
Yeah, no, for me, I'm just in this mode where every night after work or over the weekend, I want to at least watch one, if not two films. So I've been getting a lot done. So I am just going to talk about a selection of films that I've watched over the last week or so. The first being that I've continued on with my coverage of the Mission Impossible films. So I've done number 2 and number 3. Number 2 was a miss. Number 3
was a hit.
Number 3 was a hit. Year 2000, year 2006, respectively, for these two. 2006, MI3. I won't even really talk about MI2. It's just a bit. It's generally weak. Whereas,
what a waste of Anthony Hopkins, am I right?
Anyway, we could talk about it forever. But MI3 was a lot of fun. Like, I knew that Philip Seymour Hoffman was in it, but when he came on the screen, I'm like, you can get me to any film by having him present in it. He is got to be one of my favorite actors of all time. I love this guy so much. And then on top of that, there was a couple of, like, Kerry Russell's in it as well. There was a couple of really key casting points. I'm like, this film is going to be good. And it was really good. So MI3 is a big action win for me, 2006. And then, like I said to you, I've still got the other 3 to work through before Dead Reckoning comes. And I agree with your recommendation. I'm probably going to park it for a little while before I go watch 4, 5, and 6. Yeah.
Good idea.
Another one for me that I'll talk about and then I'll throw to you is I watched the most recent Scream. So I know you were a big fan of this one when it came out.
I've mentioned that, have I?
Yeah, just once or twice. I got around to watching it. I really enjoyed it as well. I did think Scream 5 was a bit better. I don't know, maybe it was just more, it's about that audience kind of context where at the time I was excited for a kind of revitalization of the Scream franchise, and that 5th one really delivered for me. And this one is a continuation of what happened in the 5th, really. I mean, all of it's a kind of a continuation across the set. But this one was a lot of fun. A lot of new things came in for it. So I really do recommend it. But it just, in terms of ranking, I'd say 5 sits a little bit higher for me.
And you and I mentioned too that, well, I was talking to you about things I got out of it, and you're like, yeah, I didn't even think of that. So depending on whether you're a big fan of the franchise or you're seeing it for the first time or whatever it might be, you're always going to be looking for something different. The thing I really responded to in it were the action set pieces, the chases, the things like that I felt were really lacking from the 5th. But if that's not what you're going into the film for, then that's not obviously going to appeal to you. So yeah, it's interesting. Everyone's going to have a different perspective.
What have you been watching?
So first up, just a very quick mention. I watched Donald Glover's comedy special, Weirdo. I think I was just a Saturday morning. I was looking for something easy to put on in the background. Donald Glover, aka Childish Gambino. I believe it's the only full comedy special he's done. Really good. Really, really good. He's just too talented. He's across the board in terms of all of his different skill sets. But it's a great one. I noticed a new John Mulaney special has come out on Netflix.
So, all right, I was going to interrupt and say,
please,
because that was something that I was going to mention is that I aside from the films that I've watched, I did get around to watching that as well. And it's fantastic as well. So now that you have some comedy stand-up in mind and maybe next Saturday morning, although this one I reckon you probably want to more sit down and immerse yourself into it.
I watched the first 10 minutes of it the other night while, I was just waiting for something. Already super, super engaged in it. So I'm very much looking forward to returning to finish it off.
It's his most personal one as well. Like, he does talk about himself a lot in it. So put some time aside for it. That was a weekly watch for me as well. Yeah.
The next, which I know you're very excited that I got around to seeing, the Evil Dead remake, the 2013 film.
Thoughts?
Enjoyed it. Yeah. Really, really enjoyed it. Some of the violence in it, very hard to watch.
Yes.
So I'm a big horror fan, but not necessarily a big gore fan. And this film is chocked full of gore. They really went all out with it. But the thing I really liked about it was that it was practical effects, which in a lot of ways makes it harder to watch because it feels more real, but very impressive effects. And it really was a great callback to the original being on such a low budget, so everything was done practically. It's a bit of a mix of a remake and a sequel. I think these days they're calling it a requel because it does have elements where it feels like they're doing nods to or even repeating plot points from the original. But then there is a cameo appearance right in the credits at the end that would suggest that is part of the same world. I did think the characters were a little underdeveloped, which is, again, a staple of horror. And the rules of the world were a bit unestablished. Like, what causes someone to turn into a deadite? They didn't even call them deadites in this one, but what causes someone to turn into it? And there wasn't a whole lot of consistency there. But overall, the sequences were great. The actual horror performances were really good, even if the characters were underdeveloped. The way they played evil was awesome. And there was a great action sequence towards the end of the film, a chase and a very obvious callback to the original film. Main character in it, whose name escapes me, but she played Mia in the film. She was great. I would love for her. I know she's not in the new Evil Dead film, but I would love for her to make an appearance with Bruce Campbell maybe down the line in another film, because I know he's definitely suggested that he would be interested in co-starring in a film with her.
Oh, right. Okay. Did you ever watch Ash vs. Evil Dead?
I did. I loved it.
Yeah. I love that he just stays around for that franchise because he knows that he is iconic as part of it. So that'd be cool. Yeah, for sure. Switching back, I have to talk about this film because if you listening to our podcast, you obviously have at least some level of interest in film. I rewatched, this is probably the third or fourth time I've seen it, 1999's American Movie, which is a documentary about a guy trying to get a movie made in 1997. It's very raw, it's beautiful, it's really heartfelt, and it's very particular talking about the technical elements of trying to make a homemade film. This guy isn't like a professional filmmaker in any sense, but the passion he puts on display as he tries to make this film. It's like, I would be very surprised if someone watched this film and didn't get at least some level of enjoyment from it, because it is just so heartwarming and so relatable, even if you're not a filmmaker, just in the endeavor of trying to pursue something and the challenges that come up in terms of money and relying on people and stuff like that. So that's American Movie. That was really good. And to round it out for me I'm going to mention it as a double feature because it's both the Safdie brothers. I went and rewatched 2019's Uncut Gems.
Ooh,
which I'd been sitting on for a while for a rewatch because I enjoyed it so much when it came out. And then I'm like, all right, this is the time. I'm going to go back to it. And I maybe even enjoyed it more this second time around. Such a good film that the way that you can use film elements to set an entire mood, the anxiety that you feel throughout this entire film is so at the front of what the audience experiences. I just love the narrative as well is just fantastic. But the look and the feel, it was very much unique in a sense. The Safdie brothers have really created the style, which I became aware of because I then went back and watched their preceding film, which I'd never seen before, called Good Time.
I've never seen it either.
2017, Good Time is the Safdie brothers again. Robert Pattinson is the protagonist in it.
I've got a Robert Pattinson shout out later.
But yeah, he does it. This could be his best acting. I was so impressed with it. Probably prefer Uncut Gems. It's a different story, totally separate worlds, very similar stylistically. But yeah, I'd recommend both films. Uncut Gems probably, it was my favorite of the two, but certainly check out Good Time as well.
Yeah, I'll have to add it to my list. I added, what was the John Travolta one that you told me about? Blowout. I've added that to my list. So
yes,
that might make an appearance next week.
Very keen to hear your thoughts on Blowout.
Next up, we have my treacherous journey into the DCEU, aka the DCU. I watched not one, but 5 films in this franchise over the last 3 days. So I have barreled them all into one underwhelming spiel. A little bit of context, I have followed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm up to date with all of their 30-something films, but never really got into the DC extended universe. Now, it's not to say I don't like DC. Grew up watching Smallville, love the Dark Knight trilogy, and I think The Batman with Rob Pattinson is perhaps my favorite of all of them so far. So I'm certainly a DC fan, but just never got into their extended universe, the Schneider universe. I had seen the first Shazam and a couple of the Suicide Squad films, but had no intention of seeing anything else. Now, you're not very up to date with your superhero franchises and things like that, so I'm providing a little context for you as well. James Gunn is taking over DC and hitting reset on all of the films. So I actually thought I had narrowly escaped and wouldn't have to go back and watch films in order to be up to date with my pop culture. But then I saw the trailer for the new Flash, which I mentioned last week.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not part of the DCU fandom, but I am a big fan of the Batman, of Batman in general, including probably my favorite, 1989 Batman. My understanding is that in The Flash, Michael Keaton's coming back as Batman.
Correct.
So I'm going to have to see it. Just
And
because of that.
This is the entire reason why I want to go see it. So just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. And look, I don't even necessarily think it's going to be a great film, but I'm just really curious about all of the, like, it may not just be Keaton. There could be a whole plethora of shameless cameos in the film.
Yeah.
So it's that combined with the fact that if this is resetting, if this is the final film that's going to start it, but it's taking place in a universe that's drawing in lots of different timelines and things like that, I wonder if this film will actually, plot-wise, be integral to that restarting. So I was curious to go back, and I thought, look, I might as well go and watch these other films. And I found a new approach to how I was going to. Initially, I was dreading it, but I've watched them, the last 5 with Maddie so far, and we just poke fun at them as we watch them through, which is a great way to experience these films.
Yeah, the other way is not to press play at all. But
Exactly, but since I'm going to, I might as well have a little fun.
Well, my understanding is that Snyder is also a big fan of slow motion, so maybe you could just play them at double speed.
So much slow motion.
And you could have got through the 3.5 hours of Justice.
Don't get me started on the 100th time I've seen his mother's pearl necklace break and fly around. But I actually kicked things off with Shazam! Fury of the Gods, which is the latest of the films, not the first. But because I'd already seen the first Shazam, it was a way to kind of ease my way into it. Has all the same flaws as the first Shazam. There's no consistency between the superhero version of Shazam and the kid, and that's made more obvious by the fact that the kid has now grown up a little bit more, so he acts older than the adult version of himself. But then I went all the way back to the start and watched Man of Steel first up. The pacing was just awful, and the fight at the end goes forever. But renaming the characters, Maddie and I did the same thing. We started referring to a really lanky character as Daddy Longlegs, and then a really stumpy side character as Mummy Short Arms. So that really helps, you know.
Did you go and update the Wikipedia for the movie?
Not yet, but it's on my to-do list. It did feature a Wilhelm scream, which was quite comical, but did not tonally fit into the film. After Man of Steel, I went into Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. It's not great, but more happens in it than the previous film, so I found it more enjoyable to watch. Wonder Woman was next up, which I actually really liked. I thought it was great. I thought Gal Gadot does a great job. Maybe the action set pieces too were just a bit better than they had previously been. Less shaky cam.
I've seen the Wonder Woman, the first one.
There you go.
84. But yeah, I like the
I was about to tell you to Gal Gadot and see it.
Yeah.
But next up, and finally, I had the Justice League, which was a mess of a film. I should clarify, I watched the original cut, the Joss Whedon cut, not the Snyder cut. I will be watching the Snyder cut, but I looked a lot into the backstory behind it, and that's more interesting than the film itself.
Yes, that's a whole separate podcast.
It is. I won't delve into the nitty gritty of the story, but I would say that in terms of those 3 films, the Batman vs. Superman, Man of Steel, and Justice League, they probably get worse in the way that they are created, but more happens in it. So I'm not saying the films get better. They certainly get worse, but I think I had more enjoyment for them watching them through, because even though Justice League was a mess of a film, if I'm poking fun at it, then I found it more enjoyable to watch than Man of Steel. So, yeah, overall, I'm having more fun with the franchise than I thought I would. I will keep you posted next week with the future installments. I know we are running low on time, so perhaps we should move on to Tantalising Trailers.
Absolutely. Now, the first one for me was the prequel to the Hunger Games that's coming out.
I saw that too.
Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So I'm a big fan of all of the Hunger Games films, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah.
That is a huge surprise.
I mean, there's one Philip Seymour Hoffman in the later
true.
2. So, I think he came in on the last 2. Especially the first one. I think they do diminish over time. But I still enjoyed 3 and 4. I can't remember the titles that they give them. They always have given these long titles.
Catching Fire was one of them, I believe.
Something about a Mockingjay is in one of them as well.
I think just Mockingjay.
Oh, okay, so they're not that long at all. But so I will go and revisit these 4 as well, because I do enjoy them a lot. I like the dystopian element of it as well. So I'm keen to see what they do with continuing on with the franchise. From the trailer, I'm like, oh, I don't know whether this is going to be great. But there was enough in there to keep me interested so that I will check it out.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
First on my list is The Equalizer 3, a guilty pleasure of mine. I just like watching Denzel being rad, kicking ass and taking names. It's certainly not a sophisticated film, 1 or 2, but it's got some cool action sequences, and honestly, I'll watch Denzel Washington in anything.
He's got to be up there with Harrison Ford in terms of like age-wise and still going around kicking bums like he's a 40-year-old.
Yeah, well, and also they're both on the same level of amazingness and never make a bad film.
We should just point out that it's been me who's chosen to bring up Harrison Ford in this podcast.
I told you I was going to be on my best behavior.
Code word, by the way, is eyes.
Nice.
For me, another one was Next Goal Wins, the new Taika Waititi film that's coming out. Michael Fassbender will be fronting up this somewhat true story. The trailer in itself is so much fun because Taika Waititi injects comedy even into the presentation of a trailer. It's got Elizabeth Moss in it and Will Arnett, and like it's based in Samoa and the Samoa soccer team who's failing. So it's very much a traditional story that we've seen where someone comes in to try and make, it's like a Cool Runnings-esque kind of vibe going on. But I'm still going to watch it because it's Taika Waititi.
Yeah, for sure.
And it was enough in the trailer to keep me excited for the comedy in it.
Nice. My next one is called Hypnotic. It is a Robert Rodriguez film. It's going to be starring Ben Affleck. Ben Affleck even. It looks quite high concept, like a Christopher Nolan-esque narrative.
What was the last Robert Rodriguez film? Like, I can't recall. I haven't seen one of his films for a while.
I couldn't tell you what the last one is, but the last one I watched was the double feature of
Planetarian Death Proof. Oh, so much fun.
But yeah, as I said, it's got a real Inception-y sort of vibe to it. But
cool.
But the trailer doesn't seem to give too much away. So I recommend you checking that one out because
Hypnotic.
Cool,
will do. Last one for me is actually one that you sent me the link to, so I wasn't aware that this was coming and was very, very pleased to get the link from you. So it is season 6 of Black Mirror.
Came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I thought they were dead, at least for a while anyway.
This series has been one where they have been erratic with the release of it. They haven't been consistent in year after year. So they have sat around for a while before they maybe did 5 or whatever. I am liking that idea that they are waiting long enough to have good stories to tell because it is an anthology series. So each episode, within reason, like there are some that cross over in narrative, but overall they are isolated episodes in terms of a story. And so they wait for great stories to be told. That said, the series is so broad that you'd think that, and like it's so beloved by many people that you'd think they'd just go and get the best writers and go, we want another series as soon as possible.
And that's the thing too, because each episode is directed by different people, written by different people, it seems like an easy show to be able to keep going consistently.
Yeah. So I'm very excited, and like the cast that's revealed, different people for different episodes, but I saw Aaron Paul's coming in. So there was a bunch there that I recognized in the trailer. Escapes me now, but very excited.
Yeah, and look, 1 to 4 I loved. I was very disappointed with season 5, so hopefully they're back on form with this one. That's why it's taken so long.
Cool.
My final thing that I want to mention is a trailer called A Haunting in Venice. Ever heard of this title before?
I feel like I have, but I couldn't tell you when.
I hadn't heard of it, and I'm a big Agatha Christie fan. This is actually going to be the next Poirot Kenneth Branagh film. So obviously they started with Murder on the Orient Express, then Death on the Nile, 2 of the most well-known Agatha Christie books that have been adapted time and time again. And so they didn't really need to put Agatha Christie or Poirot in the title for them because they're so well-known. However, this one, as a huge Agatha Christie fan, my dad's got all the books at home. I'd never heard of this before. So I'm sure he has heard of it, but I feel they're really doing themselves a disservice by not putting Poirot or Agatha Christie in the title somewhere. I stumbled upon this trailer because someone sent it to me, not because I saw it and thought, oh, the next Poirot. I haven't been particularly fond of the last 2 that have come out, even as a big fan of Agatha Christie, but I feel like their major drawing card is to say, it's another one in this series. And when you read the title, A Haunting in Venice, you have no idea that that's the case. So the trailer looks okay, but it looks to have a lot more supernatural elements than you would ordinarily expect.
Maybe they're trying to segment them because of that. Like if you look at the preceding two, they are more kind of meant to be somewhat realistic in possibility, whereas this has got the haunting in it. Yeah.
Well, I suspect that it might seem like it's a haunting at first and then perhaps reveal that
like
was
a
not the case.
Scooby-Doo kind of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I would have got away with it too. Yeah.
It's Old Man Jenkins. Alrighty, guys. So we will leave it there. I do want to just remind people, please do like the podcast, subscribe to the channel as well, and share it around. It is really important for us, but it also means that you guys stay up to date with different things we're releasing. Comments for future film suggestions would be great as well.
Like, we really cannot tell you enough, stress enough that what you tell us you want to watch, that's what we want to watch as well. We really are interested in what the students are interested in.
For sure. A reminder too that those suggestions do need to be G and PG at the moment. We have had a couple of suggestions come through in comments, which I've greatly appreciated, but unfortunately they weren't suitable films in order for us to be talking about just yet. But perhaps when we get to our holiday period, we can revisit some of those M or MA suggestions. I just asked you before if you had a sign-off line. I'm wondering if something's struck you, a bit of inspiration.
I was contemplating going off and like screaming at the sky and asking it for rain and smiling if it happened, just so we had an excuse to stay in and watch some more movies.
Yeah, it sounds good to me, but don't tempt the gods.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, guys.
Bye all.